Hi, this is Kevin. Welcome back to the video series on automating migrations of on-premise WebSphere applications to IBM Bluemix. This is the third and final video in the series. In part 1 of the video series, you learn how to use IBM Urban Code to deploy to automate the configuration of IBM Bluemix, including the provisioning of WebSphere application server environment and the secure gateway, and much more. In part 2 of the video series, you learned how to use IBM Urban Code Deploy in conjunction with the output from the WebSphere application server configuration migration tool to automate the migrations of your WebSphere configurations to IBM Bluemix. In this part of the video series, part 3, you're going to learn how to use IBM Urban Code Deploy to develop optimized deployments of WebSphere applications to IBM Bluemix environment. Developing an automated DevOps deployment process in Urban Code Deploy begins with constructing the various components that are needed to be deployed. These components can be anything such as database drivers, web applications, EJB, WebSphere resource configuration, EAR files, just to name a few. Like you saw the migration component from part 2 of the video series, these components consist of artifacts such as actual scripts, the EAR file for deployments, and the database drivers, and a process that defines how to deploy each of the component. And each of these components are deployed to a specific WebSphere scope, such as cell, node, or server, in the WebSphere topology. So I've already created the necessary components to deploy the Plants by WebSphere application. We simply need to add the components to the Urban Code Deploy resource tree in the appropriate WebSphere scopes. Don't worry, I'll provide a bit more detail on these components as we get into the demo. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is add the resources to the Urban Code Deploy resource tree for our Bluemix environment. So here's where I've already added the Plants by WebSphere migration component, which we did in part 2 of the series. So now we're going to add additional components to automate our deployment process. So at the server scope, I have a couple of components that we will add simply by adding the using the add component from the menu bar. And in the server scope, what we want to do is deploy the EAR file. Another component that we want to add to the server scope is setting the JPA specification of the server to use JPA version 2.0 rather than the default JPA specification of 2.1. This will match the JPA spec used by our application. Going up to the node scope, there's a couple of components that we want to add. The first thing we want to do is add a component that will be used to update the configuration of the node scope for our application. This particular component was built by Urban Code Deploy, and I've just templatized it for our use, matching environment variables that we'll use for deployments, and I'll show you that in a few moments. Next in the node scope is one additional component I need to add, which is to install or actually copy the DB2 drivers to the environment on WebSphere for Bluemix. And that's it. That's all the resources we need in our tree to be able to successfully deploy our Plants by WebSphere application server and configure our server environment. Okay, next, let's take a look at the components that I've just added to the resource tree and talk about what these actually do in our deployment process. First, let's take a look at the Plants EAR component. This is a component that's used for deploying the Plants by WebSphere application. So this component actually contains the EAR file that we're going to deploy, in which case I have the latest version is version 7, and you'll notice that there is a Plants by WebSphere EAR file in this component, which will be actually uploaded and deployed on the WebSphere environment in Bluemix. Now this component also consists of a process, and the process that we use to actually deploy the EAR file. So I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about this process, but it's pretty straightforward, things you would do if you were doing it manually. such as upload the EAR file to the Bluemix environment, If the application's already running, please stop it. Uninstall the application if it needs to be uninstalled, and then install or update the application as needed. Wait for the application to complete, and then start the application. Very common set of tasks that you would do if you were to do this manually. All right, let's take a look at another component. Setting the JPA specification back to 2.0 on the server. This component, as I mentioned, is simply just running an WSAdmin script that sets the appropriate JPA level. So there's no artifacts associated with this. There's just simply a script that we run, so WSAdmin script, in which case you can see that I have the script that just runs WSAdmin tasks to set the appropriate level of the spec on the server. And then the next step in the process is to restart the server, which is needed after making that type of change on the environment. Okay, another component that we are using is uploading the database drivers, the DB2 database drivers, to the system. And in this case, we do have versions of the drivers, and in this case, the artifacts actually consist of the jar files from the DB2 libraries, right? So these will get moved up to Bluemix. And the process that we use for this component is to copy the drivers. Is basically, if they already exist in a location, let's delete them. Let's create the new directory where we would like them to be and where they're expected to be, and then load the drivers to the system. Okay, so the next component to look at, the final component to look at, is actually the node configuration for our Plants by WebSphere application. This one's a little bit different and unique in that this component was actually created by Urban Code Deploy. And so this is a component that got constructed by actually pulling in the resources from the environment. So I have multiple versions of this component for which I've been making updates to the actual artifacts associated with it. Now, the artifacts associated with this is a JSON file that represents the node configuration in such a format that it's not version aware of WebSphere, and so this is just representation for Urban Code Deploy of that configuration. All right, so let's go ahead and look at the application and our environment variables that we need for deployment. So in our Bluemix environment, I have the opportunity to specify environment-specific properties for our deployment. And these are important as I've identified 4 particular areas that could be different between environments and need to be updated. The first is the port number for the database, and the second is the host name of the database server, and then the user install route for WebSphere and the WAS install route for WebSphere. So I've created these environment variables, and these will get substituted into those tokens as I deploy the node configuration. So what's unique about the database port number and host is that instead of using the actual database server host and port number, we're actually using the port number and host name of the secure gateway destination that's been defined in a previous demo in this video series. Okay, so just before I go ahead and deploy, run the automated deployment process, let's go ahead and look at what that process looks like. And I'm going to use this Plants by WebSphere deploy to Bluemix process when we run our automation. And it's very straightforward because it just basically invokes those components in the orchestrated process that I want them to run. In other words, we're going to do the node configuration first, then I'm going to install the database drivers, then I'm going to deploy the Plants by WebSphere EAR file, and then I'm going to set the JPA spec level to 2.0 and restart the server. And at the end of this process, we would expect that the Plants by WebSphere application and the server configuration be fully operational and our application be ready to go. All right, so let's go ahead and run the deployment process. And on the Bluemix environment, we basically just click the Run button and specify the process that I just showed you to deploy to Bluemix. And as normal, we would need to specify the versions of the components that we want to use. In this case, I'm just going to select the latest version available for all the components, which is the common thing to do. And then I will submit the deployment process. Now, this will take probably 5 or 6 minutes to run to completion. So I'm going to pause the video for just a few minutes, and then when it completes, I will be back with you. Okay, I'm back. That process to deploy our application to IBM Bluemix has successfully completed. The total elapsed time was a little over 5 minutes. Not too bad, considering that all I had to do was drink a little coffee while the process ran. So there's a couple of steps in here you notice that are probably red here, which is okay based on the way I've defined my application deployment process. And these are simply because the application wasn't running, so it couldn't stop, and it was already uninstalled. So these are expected to fail the first time I'd run the deployment. However, the deployment can be run over and over, right? And so the next time I would run the deployment, these steps would actually be green. All right, so with the deployment done, let's go and look at the results in our WebSphere Administrative Console. The first thing we should look at is to determine whether our application actually is installed and started successfully. And there's our Plants by WebSphere application, and it looks like it's in the running state, so that's good news. The other thing to look at are the resources for our database that had already been migrated, but in this case have been updated to reflect the database host and port that we need to go through the secure gateway to access our on-premise local database. So in this case, the database configuration has indeed been updated to use the host and port number of our secure gateway destination for our DB2 database. So that looks good. The next thing to do would be to test the connection and see if we can actually access that database. And according to this, we have a successful test, so we can access that database. So all in all, things looking pretty good. The next thing to do is let's run the application and see how things work out. The main page is just an HTML page, so not much could go wrong there. However, clicking on any of the items in the tabs would actually go to the DB2 database and bring in the inventory of the trees or flowers or vegetables. So in this case, I brought back an inventory of trees from my database, indicating that my application appears to be working exactly as designed. So with that, you have now seen and been aware of how to use IBM Urban Code Deploy to migrate applications to WebSphere on Bluemix and create an automated DevOps process for continuous delivery. Thanks very much for tuning into this demo series.